Hello everybody, Lord Almighty here. Today is Sunday, June 18th, 2017, and I have returned to my old stomping grounds. This is Ardmere Pond in Somerset County, New Jersey, and I spent many of my formative years fishing this pond because it was really the closest place to my house and I could just walk here whenever I wanted to. This is where I would come on Saturdays after watching the fishing shows in the morning on the Nashville Network, if anybody remembers that. So there were the Bassmasters, the In-Fishermen, Bill Dance, Roland Martin, Orlando Wilson. I'd watch what those guys were doing, and I would take those techniques to this pond and see if they would work or not. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but I learned a lot about fishing by fishing this little pond, and I have not been back in a long time, and things have certainly changed. But hopefully the one thing that hasn't changed is that there are still fish to catch. So as I said, this place has really changed over the years. I remember many years ago they dredged it, and after that they cut away a lot of the old shoreline cover, like the overhanging trees and the brush piles, and they put this chunk rock all around the edge here, I guess trying to make it look pretty. Honestly, it's never going to look like anything more than a mud hole in the middle of town, but despite all that, there were always some really good fish here. I remember there used to be a tree overhanging right about here, and you would just park yourself under that tree and you could catch crappie all day long. You tie on like a little curly tail grub and just toss it out there, and you know, every 5 or 6 casts you'd wind up getting a crappie. Nothing big really, but you could easily catch 40 or 50 of them in a day. So that was always a fun time, just coming down here and wearing out the crappie on light tackle. It's the type of fishing I still enjoy doing today. This spot here was always pretty interesting. You would get fish that would wash in from the main pond into this little drainage basin. Usually it would be sunfish and bullheads, and you could catch them pretty well out of here some days. Just drop a piece of worm down there and, you know, pretty much every cast you'd be able to hook into something. I also remember that there used to be a huge snapping turtle that lived in here. The thing must have been at least 20 pounds. I gotta wonder if he still lives in here. Boy, how much time have I spent with a fishing pole leaning up against this fence. Whenever ice out happened, the first time there was open water on this pond, I would come down here with a box full of little grubs and jig heads and a couple of small slip bobbers, and I just cast them right out here because that's where the first crappie of the spring were hanging out. And this is normally where I would begin my fishing year, usually around like the middle to the end of March. And I remember getting those first few crappie out of this spot. Boy, there was nothing that felt more like spring than that. This spot right here was one that produced a milestone for me. This is where I caught my first ever largemouth bass on a jig. It was a black and blue jig with a black Uncle Josh pork chunk trailer. And it was the middle of February, and it was like 70 degrees that day. The ice was off of the pond, and there was a little stick up in the water. It was about maybe as big around as a pencil. And I flipped this jig in there, and my line starts moving off, and it wound up being a pretty solid bass. It was like a 3-pounder. So that was when I learned not really like how to fish a jig per se, but the fact that jigs actually catch fish. Because until that point, you know, the only way I had seen them work was from watching it on TV when the Bassmasters were using it. And to actually take that technique, bring it here and have it work for me, it was, you know, at the time for me, it was a really big accomplishment. And jigs have been somewhere in my tackle box ever since. This spot right here was very important to my... Oh, there's a fish. Look at that. There's one of those crappie I like to catch out of here. Get that little Rapala. Alright. Just like old times. Anyway, as I was saying, this spot's very important in my development as a fisherman. There was a brush pile right out in the middle of the pond, right about there. And I was fishing with a chartreuse and blue spinnerbait. And it's one of those situations where you look at the spot and you know there's a fish there. So I cast out with the spinnerbait, brought it right through the brush pile, nothing. Took another cast, same spot, nothing. Third cast, same spot, nothing. And I just looked at that spot and I said, there has got to be a fish there. There is no way that there is not a fish there. So I took a fourth cast, same spot, slowed the bait way down so it was like scraping over the tops of the brush. And I get a hit. And I set the hook and I wind up catching about a 4-pound bass. So that taught me two very valuable lessons. When you see a spot that looks like there should be a fish on it, you make multiple casts, and if you don't get anything, you slow the bait down. Give the fish several opportunities to get it, give them a couple of different looks at the lure, and only move on when you're absolutely sure that there's nothing there. Man, this was such a great place to go fishing when I was a kid. Sometimes my dad would come home from work, I'd ask if we could go fishing, and he'd say, "Bubba, I'm just too tired." So I would grab my gear, take a walk down here, fish for an hour or two, normally get a couple of bass or a bunch of crappie, and that was my youth. You know, while the rest of my friends were going to the movies, going to the mall, hanging out, I would be here trying to catch fish. And there was a bunch of different kinds of fish in here too. Not only bass and crappie, but of course you'd have sunfish, you'd have bullheads, channel cats, carp. Big carp in here. My brother and I used to snag them. Sometimes by accident, but sometimes intentionally. And if you've never snagged in the back a pissed off 2-foot carp, boy, let me tell you, you got a fight on your hands. Boy, this spot right here, this brings back some amazing memories. Some of the older neighborhood kids would sometimes hang out in this park, and one night they decided that they were going to throw a picnic table into the water right about here. And one of those kids may or may not have been my brother, but anyway, they unwittingly created the best structure that this pond has ever seen. You could fish around that picnic table in the water, and you could catch as many crappie and sunfish as you wanted. And I am not at all exaggerating. You could stand next to that picnic table for 2 hours and it would be non-stop fish after fish. It was absolutely incredible. Again, nothing super big, but literally every cast, or at least every other cast, you were getting bit. It's the kind of stuff that kids dream about. That secret fishing hole. And all it took were a few stupid teenagers to make it. Oh my God, you gotta be kidding. Look at this. a green sunfish. Let's see. Let's compare. Let me get the hook out first. But well, he wouldn't let me compare. But I would say he was certainly no bigger than the lure I caught him on. God, those things are suicidal sometimes. Back before this pond was dredged, there was a gravel bank that came out on that side of the pond. And I remember one day I was fishing off that gravel bank, and there was another kid fishing there too. He was probably a couple of years older than I was. And he caught a sunfish. It was a pumpkin seed sunfish. And the fish had swallowed the hook. And he looks at me and he says, "I have to get my hook back." So he puts this fish on the ground, and with the heel of his foot, he smashes the fish open, and he roots around in the guts, and he grabs the hook, and he holds it up, and almost triumphantly he says, "I got my hook back." I didn't say anything. I doubt it would have mattered if I did, but I made it a point not to fish around that kid anymore. There's a fish. That looks like a largie. Yes, sir. All right. Brought some salad with him. There we go. Not big, but that's the first one in a while. First Ardmere Pond largemouth bass in many, many years. So let's see, we got a sunfish, a crappie, a largemouth. If I can somehow get a channel cat, that'd be the Ardmere Pond Slam. Now this spot right here, aside from being one of the better spots on the pond, this is the spot where I broke the first fishing rod I ever owned. It was a Christmas gift from when I was 4 years old. It was a Daiwa Ultralight, and I had used it for at least 10 years, so I had certainly gotten enough mileage on it. And that pole, it didn't have blank through construction like the poles today do. The blank pretty much stopped right at the foregrip, and from the foregrip back to the butt section was basically a hollow aluminum tube. And I snagged a lure in this spot, and I tried to pull it free, and after years of just use and stress, that tube snapped right between the foregrip and the reel seat. And it was weird. I remember not being as upset about it as I thought I should be, because, that was my first ever pole. It was the one I learned to fish with, basically. And now it was broken. But I didn't really feel much. I just went home and got one of my other rods. This spot was also where I got one of the most amazing strikes from a bass that I have ever seen. I was using a buzzbait, and I could see the fish coming in from a few feet away. Its back was out of the water, its mouth was open, its gills were flared, and he just raced in and absolutely obliterated this buzzbait. And I was completely shocked, because first of all, I had no idea that largemouth bass could swim that fast, and I had no idea they could be so vicious. I mean, this thing just absolutely murdered this buzzbait. So that was really kind of the first thing that tipped me off that largemouth bass are in fact an apex predator, and they can be extremely violent. So I have fished around this whole pond, and it actually took less time than I remember it taking. Wasn't quite as fish filled as I normally like my trips to be, but I did catch a few, and the fact that there are still fish in here is really encouraging, because to me that means maybe some neighborhood kid will discover this pond, and he'll come here on weekends, and he'll come here after school, and little by little, year by year, this pond will make that kid a better fisherman, just like it did for me. So thank you all so much for joining me today, and I will see you on the next adventure.